The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah Mae Whitmore's weathered wagon creaked to a halt before what was supposed to be her new beginning. Dust swirled around the wooden wheels, and she shielded her eyes with a gloved hand, squinting at the adobe ranch house that now belonged to her. The structure looked solid enough, with thick walls designed to keep out both heat and unwanted visitors. A small barn stood nearby, and she could make out the skeletal remains of what had once been corrals. "This is it, girl," she murmured to her mare, patting the horse's neck. "Our fresh start." Sarah climbed down from the wagon seat, her dark blue traveling dress dusty from 3 days of hard riding from Tucson. At 27, she carried herself with the determined grace of a woman who had learned to rely on herself. Her auburn hair was pinned back practically, though rebellious strands had escaped during the journey. The inheritance from her late husband's mysterious business dealings had been enough to buy this remote ranch, far from the prying eyes and whispered gossip of Boston society. She untied her leather satchel and a small trunk from the wagon, expecting to find an empty house waiting to be claimed. The deed in her bag was signed and legal, purchased sight unseen from a desperate seller in Tucson who needed money fast. As she approached the heavy wooden door, she noticed it was slightly ajar. "Hello?" she called out, thinking perhaps the previous owner had left it open to air out the house. "Anyone there?" The silence stretched for several heartbeats before she pushed the door wider and stepped inside. The interior was dim after the blazing sunshine, and she blinked rapidly, trying to adjust her vision. The main room was surprisingly well-maintained, with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn table, and what appeared to be recently used cooking implements. A shadow moved in her peripheral vision. Sarah spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. 4 men emerged from various corners and doorways of the house, moving with the fluid silence of predators. They were Apache. That much was immediately clear from their dark hair, bronze skin, and the traditional elements mixed with their practical frontier clothing. Each man was powerfully built, their bodies honed by a life of survival in harsh terrain. The tallest stepped forward first. He appeared to be the eldest, perhaps 29, with intelligent dark eyes and a calm bearing that suggested leadership. A thin scar ran along his left cheekbone, and he wore leather leggings with a cotton shirt that had seen better days. "You are the woman who bought this place," he said in clear English, though accented with his native tongue. It wasn't a question. Sarah's mouth went dry, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "I am Sarah Mae Whitmore, and yes, this ranch belongs to me. Who are you, and what are you doing in my house?" A younger man with broader shoulders and fierce eyes laughed sharply. "Your house? We have been living here for 2 moons, white woman. The previous owner fled like a rabbit when the cavalry came through." "Bidzil," the leader said quietly, and the fierce one fell silent. He turned back to Sarah. "I am Ayana. These are my brothers, Naalnish, Bidzil, and Keme." He gestured to each man in turn. "We mean you no harm, but neither will we be driven from shelter we have claimed." Sarah's eyes darted between the 4 men, calculating her options. Running would be futile. They could easily catch her before she reached the wagon. Besides, where would she go? Tucson was 3 days away, and the desert was full of dangers far worse than 4 Apache warriors who spoke English and hadn't immediately harmed her. "This is legally my property," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I have the deed." "Papers mean nothing to dead men," said the 3rd warrior, who appeared slightly younger than the others. His voice was gentler, though his meaning was clear. "Out here, possession is what matters." The youngest, barely more than 23, stepped closer with curious eyes. "Why does a woman travel alone to such a place? Where is your husband? Your people?" "That's none of your concern," Sarah replied sharply, then immediately regretted her tone. These men held all the power in this situation, and antagonizing them would serve no purpose. Ayana studied her for a long moment. "You seek to escape something," he observed. "This is a place men come to disappear. Women too, it seems." The afternoon light streaming through the windows shifted as clouds passed overhead, casting moving shadows across the tense scene. Sarah became acutely aware of how isolated they were, how completely she was at their mercy. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. Ayana exchanged glances with his companions before answering. "Survival. The cavalry scattered our band 3 moons ago. We cannot return to our people without risking their safety, and we cannot go to the reservation." His jaw tightened with barely contained anger. "So we remain here, where white men's papers say we should not be. And now I'm here," Sarah said. "Yes." Ayana stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "You will sleep with us, white woman. This is not a choice." Sarah's breath caught, and she took a step backward. "I will not—" "You misunderstand," Nalnish interrupted, and she caught a glimpse of amusement in his expression. "He means you will sleep here, in this place, under our protection. The desert holds many dangers for a woman alone." Heat flooded Sarah's cheeks as she realized her mistake. I see." Bidzil crossed his arms over his broad chest. "The question is whether you will share this space as an enemy or as—" He seemed to search for the right word. "A neighbor." Keme, the youngest, was examining her travel-worn dress with frank curiosity. "You have supplies, food?" Sarah nodded toward the door. "Some, in my wagon." "Then we eat tonight," Ayana declared. "Tomorrow, we decide what comes next." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Sarah realized her new life in the Arizona Territory would be far more complicated than she had ever imagined. The evening meal was a tense affair. Sarah had unpacked her meager supplies: salt pork, hardtack, coffee, and canned peaches, while Nalnish returned from hunting with 2 desert rabbits. The skilled tracker had field-dressed them with swift, practiced movements that spoke of a lifetime spent living off the land. As they sat around the rough wooden table, Sarah found herself stealing glances at each man. Hayana maintained his calm authority, distributing the food with careful precision to ensure everyone received an equal share. Bidzil ate with the intensity he seemed to bring to everything, his fierce eyes occasionally flicking towards Sarah with undisguised suspicion. Nalnish was quieter, more observant, while young Keme peppered her with questions between bites. "Where did you come from?" Keme asked, his English heavily accented but clear. "Your hands are soft. You are not from this place." "Boston," Sarah replied carefully. "My husband died and I needed a change." "Boston," Bidzil repeated with disdain. "City of the bluecoats, who hunt us like animals." "Bidzil," Ayana warned again, but the younger man's anger was palpable. "She could be a spy," Bidzil continued, his voice rising. "Sent to find us, to bring the cavalry down on our heads." Sarah set down her fork, meeting his hostile gaze directly. "If I were a spy, don't you think I would have arrived with soldiers instead of alone in a rickety wagon?" Nalnish made a sound that might have been laughter. "She has a point, brother." "Besides," Sarah continued, "I paid good money for this ranch. Why would the government pay me to spy on 4 men when they could simply take the land?" Ayana nodded approvingly. "Your reasoning is sound, but Bidzil's caution is not misplaced. Trust is earned slowly in these times." As darkness fell, the practical matter of sleeping arrangements arose. The ranch house had 2 rooms, the main living area, and a smaller back room that had likely been the bedroom. Sarah eyed the single bed visible through the doorway. "I'll sleep outside," she announced, standing to gather her things. "No." Ayana's tone brooked no argument. "Too dangerous. Coyotes, snakes, bandits." "Then where?" "You take the bed," Nalnish said simply. "We are used to hard ground." Sarah hesitated. Accepting their protection felt like admitting defeat, but she wasn't foolish enough to ignore the genuine dangers of the Arizona night. "I have blankets in my wagon. Kemi will fetch them," Ayana decided. The youngest warrior rose immediately, disappearing into the darkness. Left alone with the 3 older men, Sarah felt the weight of her situation settle over her like a heavy cloak. "How long have you been separated from your people?" 3 months, Ayana replied. "Maybe 4. Time moves differently when you are hunted." "What happened?" Bidzil's jaw tightened, but Nalnish answered. "There was a misunderstanding. A rancher's cattle went missing, and he blamed the nearest Apache band. The cavalry came to investigate, and when some of our young men ran instead of submitting to questioning, they assumed guilt," Sarah finished. "Always," Ayana said quietly. "In the confusion, we became separated from our families. By the time the truth was discovered, that Mexican raiders had stolen the cattle, it was too late. We were already marked as hostiles." Kemi returned with Sarah's blankets, and the men began arranging their bedrolls around the fireplace. The domesticity of the scene struck her as surreal, 4 Apache warriors preparing for sleep in her legally purchased home. "What about your families?" Sarah asked softly. "Wives? Children?" A shadow crossed Ayana's face. "Nalnish has a wife and daughter. The others are unmarried." Sarah looked at Nalnish with new understanding. "You must want to return to them desperately." "Every day," he admitted. "But if I lead soldiers to them—" He shook his head. "Better to wait, to find another way." What if there is no other way? Sarah asked. There is always another way, Ayanna said firmly. We simply have not found it yet. Sarah retreated to the bedroom, closing the door behind her. The bed was more comfortable than she'd expected, though she lay awake for hours listening to the soft murmur of voices from the main room. The men spoke in their native language, the musical syllables rising and falling, like a gentle song. She thought about her life in Boston, the suffocating propriety and endless whispered judgments. Here, surrounded by four men who by all accounts should have been her enemies, she felt more honest conversation than she'd experienced in years of society gatherings. A sound outside made her tense, hoofbeats approaching in the distance. The voices in the main room ceased immediately. Sarah, Ayanna called quietly, do not make any sound. She slipped from the bed and pressed her ear to the door. Through a gap in the wooden planks, she could see the men moving with deadly efficiency. Bidzil and Keme flanked the windows while Nalnish extinguished the lamp. Ayanna positioned himself by the door, a rifle appearing in his hands as if from nowhere. The hoofbeats grew closer, then stopped. Sarah held her breath, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it could be heard through the walls. "Hello, the house," a rough voice called out. "We're looking for a woman traveling alone. Pretty little thing with auburn hair." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Someone was tracking her already. The men in the main room remained perfectly still, waiting. "Saw her wagon tracks leading this way," another voice added. "She's got something that belongs to our boss." Sarah's mind raced. What could they possibly want from her? She'd been careful to leave Boston quietly, taking only what was rightfully hers. "Maybe nobody's home," a third voice suggested. "Or maybe they're just being smart," the first man replied. "We'll check the barn, then circle back." The sound of horses moving away provided little relief. Sarah knew they would return, and when they did, her presence here would endanger not only herself, but the four men who had, despite everything, offered her protection. When Ayanna finally knocked softly on her door, she opened it immediately. "Who are they?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," Sarah whispered truthfully. "But they're looking for me specifically. What did you take when you left Boston?" Sarah met his penetrating gaze. "Nothing that wasn't mine by right. But my husband, his business dealings weren't always honest. Perhaps someone thinks I know more than I do." Ayanna studied her face in the dim light. "Truth? Truth," she confirmed. "Then we have a problem," he said grimly. "Because they will be back, and when they return they will not ask politely." Outside, the desert wind began to howl, as if echoing the danger closing in around them all. Dawn brought no relief from the tension. The mysterious riders had circled the property twice during the night, before disappearing into the desert, but their threat lingered like smoke in the air. Sarah found herself working alongside the four Apache men as they prepared defenses, the previous day's awkwardness replaced by grim necessity. "Can you shoot?" Ayanna asked, checking the loading of an old Winchester rifle. "My father taught me," Sarah replied, accepting the weapon with steady hands, "though I've never shot at a man." "Pray you do not have to today," Nalnish said quietly, positioning himself at the window facing the main approach. His gentle demeanor had transformed into something harder, more dangerous. Bidzil emerged from the back room carrying several boxes of ammunition. "There are 6 of them," he reported. "I counted their tracks, all well armed." "What do they want with you?" Kime asked Sarah directly, his youthful curiosity now edged with concern. Sarah set down the rifle and faced them all. "My husband Charles was involved in some questionable business dealings before he died. Railroad contracts, mining claims, things that weren't entirely legal. When he passed, I inherited everything, including documents that might implicate powerful men." "And you brought these documents here?" Bidzil's voice carried a note of accusation. "I brought everything I owned," Sarah admitted. "I didn't know what was important and what wasn't. Most of it seemed like boring business papers." Ayanna considered this. "These men, they think you have evidence that could hurt them. Possibly. Though I swear I don't know what they're specifically after." The sound of approaching horses cut short their conversation. This time the riders made no attempt at stealth. Sarah counted at least 6 mounted figures cresting the hill that overlooked the ranch, silhouetted against the morning sky like harbingers of violence. "Sarah Whitmore," the leader's voice carried clearly across the distance. "We know you're in there. Send out the papers and we'll ride away peaceful-like." Ayanna positioned himself beside the door, his movements fluid and sure. "How much do you trust us?" he asked Sarah quietly. "With my life, apparently," she replied, surprised by her own certainty. "Then do exactly as I say." He raised his voice, calling out in accented English, This is Apache land now. White woman is under our protection. A moment of stunned silence followed before harsh laughter erupted from the riders. Apaches? Even better. We'll collect the bounty on your scalps after we finish our business. That was a mistake, Nalnish observed dryly. What followed happened with terrifying speed. The riders spurred their horses forward, spreading out to surround the ranch house. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions, wood splintering as bullets struck the thick adobe walls. Sarah found herself pressed against the wall beside Nalnish, the Winchester clutched in her trembling hands. Through the window, she could see a bearded man taking cover behind a water trough, his rifle aimed at their position. "Can you hit him from here?" Nalnish asked calmly, as if they were discussing the weather. Sarah took a shaky breath, raised the rifle, and squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, but close enough to send the man scrambling for better cover. "Not bad for a Boston lady," Kem called out from across the room, grinning despite the danger. A bullet immediately shattered the window frame inches from his head, wiping the smile from his face. The battle raged for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The Apache warriors moved with coordinated precision, their years of survival creating an unspoken communication that allowed them to cover each other's movements perfectly. Bidzil, living up to his fierce reputation, had somehow made it to the barn and was picking off riders from that position. His angry shouts in Apache punctuated each shot, and Sarah suspected he was enjoying himself. "2 down," Ayana reported grimly. 4 still fighting. Sarah reloaded the Winchester with hands that had steadied as the adrenaline took hold. The next time a rider appeared in her sight, she didn't hesitate. The man cried out and tumbled from his horse, clutching his shoulder. "That's 3, she said with grim satisfaction. Nalnish looked at her with new respect. "Remind me never to anger you, woman." The remaining attackers seemed to realize they were facing more resistance than expected. Their leader called for a retreat, and the surviving men spurred their horses away from the ranch, dragging their wounded with them. "They'll be back," Ayana said as the dust settled, "probably with more men." Sarah slumped against the wall, suddenly exhausted. "I'm sorry. I never meant to bring this danger to you." "Danger was already here," Nalnish replied philosophically. "We simply gave it a different face." Keme approached the window cautiously. "They left one behind." He gestured toward a still form near the water trough. Bidzil jogged back from the barn, his dark eyes bright with the aftermath of violence. "The one I shot is still breathing," he reported. "Should I finish him?" "No," Ayana decided. "We are not murderers, but we will question him." The wounded man turned out to be more terrified than defiant. Faced with 4 Apache warriors and a woman who had shot one of his companions, he talked readily. "Boss wants them railroad papers," he gasped, pressing a bloody hand to his leg wound. "Something about a survey that never happened. Money that got paid twice. Says the woman's got proof that could hang him." "What's your boss's name?" Sarah demanded. "Jeremiah Stokes. Owns half of Tucson, or claims to. Got himself elected to the territorial legislature last year." Sarah's face went pale. "I know that name. Charles mentioned him several times. They were partners in some mining venture. Papers worth killing for," Ayana observed. "Worth hanging for if what this man says is true," Nalnish added. The wounded man struggled to sit up. "You folks got any idea what you're up against? Stokes has got judges in his pocket, half the cavalry taking his money. He could wipe this place off the map and call it an Indian raid gone wrong." "Let him try," Bidzil snarled, but Ayana held up a restraining hand. "We need those papers," the Apache leader told Sarah. "If they truly contain evidence of corruption, they might be worth more than Stokes realizes." Sarah nodded slowly. "They're in my trunk. I'll get them." As she retrieved the documents, Sarah realized something had fundamentally changed. These 4 men were no longer strangers sharing her house. They had become her allies, bound together by shared danger and mutual trust. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt something she hadn't experienced since Charles's death, the comfort of belonging somewhere. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and Sarah couldn't help but think they were an omen of the greater conflicts yet to come. 3 days had passed since the attack, and the ranch had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Sarah found herself working alongside the men with increasing ease, her hands growing calloused from helping repair the bullet-damaged walls and tend to the small vegetable garden behind the house. The documents from her trunk lay spread across the wooden table, revealing a web of corruption that reached far beyond what any of them had imagined. "Railroad money paid twice for the same survey," Ayana read aloud, his finger tracing the cramped handwriting. "Land grants issued for territory that doesn't exist. Charles was meticulous in his record-keeping. Too meticulous for his own good, apparently, Sarah said bitterly. She was kneading bread dough, a domestic task that felt surreal given their circumstances. He must have realized Stokes was using him. Nalnish looked up from cleaning his rifle. The question is, what do we do with this knowledge? We cannot simply ride into Tucson and present it to the authorities. Half the authorities are probably involved, Bidzil added darkly. He had been restless since the attack, pacing the small house like a caged mountain lion. Keme, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. There is someone who might help. Father Miguel at the mission near Tubac. He speaks for those who have no voice, writes letters to the government in Washington. A priest? Sarah asked skeptically. He helped my cousin's family when they were falsely accused of stealing horses, Kim explained. He is different from other white men. Fair. Ayana considered this. It would mean traveling through dangerous territory. Stokes will have men watching the roads. Then we don't take the roads, Bidzil said with a predatory smile. We know ways through the desert that no white man could follow. As evening approached, Sarah found herself alone with Ayana while the others tended to the animals. The Apache leader was studying a hand-drawn map, planning their route to the mission. You don't have to do this, Sarah said quietly. This fight isn't yours. Ayana looked up, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. When someone offers shelter to those who need it, their troubles become ours. It is our way. Is that the only reason? The words escaped before Sarah could stop them, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. For a long moment, Ayana studied her face. No, he said simply. It is not. The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. Sarah had been aware of the growing tension, the way their hands sometimes brushed when passing food, the way his eyes followed her movements. She had told herself it was merely gratitude, but her racing heart suggested otherwise. This is impossible, she whispered. In Boston they would— We are not in Boston, Ayana interrupted gently. Out here, different rules apply. Before Sarah could respond, Nalnish appeared in the doorway. Riders approaching from the north, he announced urgently. At least a dozen. The intimate moment shattered as they sprang into action. But this time, the approaching party carried a white flag and rode openly up the main path. As they drew closer, Sarah recognized the blue uniforms of cavalry soldiers. Federal troops, Kemi observed, peering through the window. Not territorial militia. A young officer dismounted and approached the house, leaving his men at a respectful distance. Hello, the house. I'm Lieutenant Morrison, United States Army. I'd like to speak with Mrs. Whitmore if she's present. Sarah exchanged glances with Ayana before opening the door. I'm Sarah Whitmore. Ma'am, I've been sent by Colonel Henderson at Fort Huachuca. We've received some disturbing reports about territorial officials, and your name came up as someone who might have information. What kind of reports? Sarah asked cautiously. Allegations of fraud involving railroad contracts and land grants. The War Department is conducting an investigation. Morrison's eyes took in the 4 Apache men positioned strategically around the room. I see you have unusual protection. These men saved my life, Sarah said firmly. They're under my protection as much as I'm under theirs. Morrison nodded slowly. I've heard stranger things in Arizona territory. Ma'am, if you have documents related to these allegations, the Army can guarantee your safety while we investigate. Bidzil stepped forward, his voice challenging. Your guarantees mean little to Apache people, soldier. You're right, Morrison admitted, surprising them all. But I'm not here as an enemy. If Mrs. Whitmore's information helps us root out corruption, it benefits everyone who's been wronged by these men. Sarah made her decision quickly. The documents are here, but I have conditions. Name them. These 4 men have been falsely branded as hostiles. I want that designation removed and safe passage guaranteed for them to return to their families. Morrison considered this. That's outside my authority, but I can make recommendations to my superiors. The Army is more interested in real criminals than men trying to survive. Over the next hour, Sarah and the lieutenant examined the documents together. Morrison's face grew increasingly grave as he read Charles's meticulous records. This is worse than we suspected, he said finally. Stokes has been systematically defrauding the government for years. These records could put him away for life. If they reach the right people, Ayana said pointedly. They will, Morrison promised. I'll personally escort them to Fort Huachuca, then on to Washington if necessary. As the soldiers prepared to leave with copies of the most damaging documents, Morrison pulled Sarah aside. Ma'am, I have to ask, are you staying here voluntarily? Because if these men are holding you against your will—" Sarah looked back at the 4 Apache warriors who had become so much more than unexpected house guests. Ayanna caught her eye and nodded slightly, understanding her unspoken question. "Lieutenant," she said clearly, "I've never been more free in my life." After the cavalry departed, and strange silence settled over the ranch. The immediate danger had passed, but with it came the realization that their forced alliance might soon end. "What happens now?" Keme asked, voicing what they were all thinking. "Now we wait," Ayanna replied, "and we decide what kind of future we want to build." Sarah felt the weight of possibility pressing down on her. In Boston, her life had been mapped out by social expectations and proper behavior. Here, surrounded by men who had shown her what honor and loyalty truly meant, she faced choices that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. That night, as she lay in the narrow bed listening to the desert wind, Sarah realized she was no longer the same woman who had arrived at this ranch. The question was, who was she becoming, and did she have the courage to find out? 2 months later, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Sarah stood on the porch, watching 4 familiar figures approach on horseback. But these riders were different. They carried no weapons openly, and behind them rode a small group of women and children. Lieutenant Morrison had been true to his word. Jeremiah Stokes was now awaiting trial in a federal prison, his network of corruption exposed and dismantled. More importantly, the Apache men had been officially cleared of all charges and granted safe passage to reunite with their families. Ayanna dismounted first, his face carefully neutral as he approached the porch. Behind him, Nalnish helped a young Apache woman down from her horse, his wife, Sarah realized, watching the tender reunion. A little girl with dark braids peeked shyly from behind her mother's skirts. "Sarah," Ayanna said formally, though his eyes held warmth, "I would like you to meet my grandmother, Eleanor, and my sister, Itzel." An elderly Apache woman stepped forward, her weathered face kind but assessing. She spoke rapidly in Apache, and Ayanna translated. "She says you are the one who protected her grandsons when they had nowhere else to go." "They protected me," Sarah replied honestly. "I just provided the roof." Elena smiled and said something else. This time Itzel, a woman about Sarah's age, translated, "She says you have the heart of a warrior woman, even if you look like a delicate white flower." Over the next few days, the ranch transformed. The Apache family set up a temporary camp nearby while they decided their next steps. Sarah found herself learning about their customs, their food, their stories. In return, she taught some of the children basic English and shared her knowledge of reading and writing, but the underlying tension remained. Everyone knew this arrangement was temporary. The Apache families would eventually move on, probably to join relatives in Mexico where they could live freely, and Sarah had decisions to make. On the 3rd evening, as the families gathered around a large fire for the evening meal, Nalnish made an announcement. "My wife and I have decided to accept the government's offer of land near the reservation. Our daughter deserves to grow up in peace, to learn both Apache ways and the white man's world." He looked at Sarah gratefully. "Because of what you did, we have that choice." Bidzil, still fierce but notably calmer around his family, had different plans. "My cousins have asked me to join them in Mexico. There I can live as Apache without bending to white man's laws." Kemi, the youngest, surprised everyone. "I want to stay near here. Maybe work for the army as a scout, help prevent the kind of misunderstandings that separated us before." All eyes turned to Ayanna, who had been unusually quiet. He stood and walked to the edge of the firelight, staring out at the desert. Sarah followed him, her heart heavy with unspoken questions. "What will you do?" she asked quietly. "That depends," he replied without turning around. "On what?" "On whether a certain stubborn white woman plans to stay on this ranch or return to Boston." Sarah moved to stand beside him. "Boston holds nothing for me now. This place, it's become home. Even with its dangers, its isolation, especially because of them." Sarah turned to face him fully. "Ayanna, I know this is impossible by most people's standards. The prejudice we'd face, the challenges. You think I care what other people believe?" Ayanna's voice was soft, but intense. "I have seen your courage, your loyalty, your heart. These matter more than the color of our skin or the words others speak. It won't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is." When they returned to the fire, Elena was waiting for them. The elderly woman studied their faces carefully, then nodded as if confirming something she'd already suspected. She spoke to Ayanna in Apache, her words carrying the weight of wisdom and blessing. When she finished, she approached Sarah and took her hands. She says, Itzel translated with a smile, that love recognizes no boundaries of tribe or nation. She gives you both her blessing if you choose to build a life together. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same spot on the porch, but everything had changed. The ranch now bustled with activity. Kimi had indeed become an army scout and used his earnings to help improve the property. A few other Apache families had settled nearby, creating a small but thriving community. Nalnish visited regularly with his wife and daughter, bringing news from the reservation and helping to build bridges between communities. Even Bidzil had returned once from Mexico, bringing trade goods and stories of freedom. But the most significant change was the presence of Ayana at her side every day. They had married in a ceremony that blended Apache traditions with American legal requirements, witnessed by both cavalry officers and tribal elders. "No regrets?" Ayana asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they watched the sun set over their land. "Only one," Sarah replied, leaning back against his chest. "What's that? I wish I'd had the courage to live this boldly sooner." As if summoned by their contentment, a rider appeared on the horizon. Sarah tensed automatically, but Ayana chuckled. "It's only Morrison. He promised to stop by on his way to Fort Huachuca." The young lieutenant had become a friend over the months, helping to navigate the complex legalities of their situation. As he dismounted, his face wore a broad grin. "I bring good news," he announced. "The territorial governor has officially recognized your community as a peaceful settlement. You'll have the same protections as any other citizens." "What does that mean exactly?" Sarah asked. "It means you're no longer an anomaly or an experiment. You're simply home." That night, as the community celebrated with dancing and storytelling, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had come to Arizona seeking escape from her past, but instead had found a future she never could have imagined. The ranch that had started as a refuge had become the foundation for something unprecedented, a place where two cultures could blend and thrive, where love could transcend the artificial boundaries society tried to impose. As she danced with Ayana under the star-filled desert sky, surrounded by friends who had once been strangers, Sarah knew she had finally found where she belonged, not despite the challenges they faced, but because of their courage to face them together. The words that had once seemed threatening, "You'll sleep with us," and had become a promise of protection, partnership, and ultimately love that defied convention and created something entirely new under the vast Arizona sky.